Stop calling them mastering engineers. Call them this instead. Hi, this is Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. Thanks for joining me for this week's episode of the SonicScoop podcast. And today, I'm going to be talking about why the term mastering engineer isn't necessarily the best term to use, because I think it confuses people. And I think it distracts us from the kinds of things that mastering engineers can do that are really most important and useful to us. So what exactly does that mean? Let me turn my phone off here so I won't get any interruptions, because I want to go deep into this idea. Why would it be confusing that we would call them mastering engineers? Well, I think it's a big misnomer, because the most important thing that mastering engineers do for you these days is not to create a master. Back in the day, creating a master was actually a big deal, because back in the day, people recorded to tape machines. But average music consumers didn't have tape machines at home. That was like the super high-tech studio technology of the day. What people listened to at home were vinyl records. So how do you get a tape onto a vinyl record? Well, someone had to go through the process of taking the final mix down on a tape and etching the sound waves created by that tape into a master copy of a vinyl record that you could then stamp out additional copies from. And this made a lot of sense back in the day because it was really hard to replicate, do like mass manufacturing of tape machines, of tape recordings. And it would be really much more expensive to try to outfit everyone at home with a tape machine. So they had to create this special master file. And that's where the word mastering engineer came from. The people who created those master copies that you'd stamp vinyl records from were mastering engineers. They were creating masters. But that is not that important anymore. Because today, what do you have to do to create a master file that you can make good copies from? Yeah, just have to hit export on your DAW. You hit bounce to disk on your DAW. You're done. You got it. You're a mastering engineer. You created a master. So what the heck does a mastering engineer do? Well, like I said, it's probably a little bit of a misnomer in this day and age, because a mastering engineer in this day and age, I would call them this instead. What's the thing that I'm going to call them? Well, I got to give a shout out to our sponsors before I totally spill the beans. So a big shout out to you, the most important sponsor of this podcast possible. How do you sponsor it? By smashing the ever-loving daylights out of the like button if you're on the YouTube version of this podcast. And if you are on the audio-only version, like on Apple Podcasts, consider giving us a 5-star rating and review. It really does help me out and making me into your virtual bestie. Okay, and also a big shout out to Soundtoys, makers of some of my favorite creative mixing effects. You can check out anything they make for free at soundtoys.com. Totally worth it. What should we call mastering engineers, if not mastering engineers? What do they do these days? Quality control. They're quality control engineers. Because that is the most important job of a mastering engineer for you in this digital age, where you can create your own masters easily. But even if you're mastering your own records for yourself, I would recommend thinking of mastering as the second process that comes after you're done mixing, a quality control process with different goals. And here's how I want you to think about the difference between mixing and mastering. In mixing, the main focus is on getting the balance levels right between individual instruments. And not just the volume balances between individual instruments, but also the tonal balance between instruments. So you're trying to make this cohesive whole where the parts fit together well, and you're really thinking mostly about the arc of the song. And one of the problems, if you put on your mastering engineer hat during mixing, is you don't focus on the things that can only be done during mixing. Rather than spend an extra 30 minutes, thinking about, hey, do I need to do an extra dB of limiting or less dB of limiting? Should I do a little bit of an extra boost at 4K or less at 4K? Rather than spending another 30 minutes thinking about these small mastering-like decisions, the overall tonal character that we're going to get to in mastering, what you should really be spending the little bits of extra last time you have in mixing is saying, could I ride this vocal? I got a pretty good mix here, but man, if we notch the vocal up by like 1 dB in the chorus, or notch the lead vocal down by a dB when these background vocals came in, so it would almost be a little dwarfed. Or actually, in this case, I want to goose up the lead vocal so it's not dwarfed by the background vocals. Those kinds of decisions, those kinds of internal decisions that mastering and quality control later can't do, if you put all of your focus there, you'll come out with a much better mix and you'll need even less mastering. So mixing is about establishing your volume relationships and your tonal balance relationships in the mix. Mastering is about taking that final, finished, done thing and doing a pass of quality control. And in that pass of quality control, we're looking at the overall tonal balance of the song. Does the song overall have too much bottom end? Not enough bottom end? Do we need more low end? Do we need less low end? Do we need more high end? Do we need less high end? That's the first stop in the overall tonal balance of mastering. But then you want to go even more concretely. Within the low end, does the low end sound balanced? Or is there too much 100 hertz and not enough 60 hertz, and we want to bring those into a better balance? Or vice versa, is there a whole heaps of 60 but not enough 100, and we want to bring those into better balance? Same thing with your mid frequencies and your high end. Those kinds of overall tonal balance questions. Also, we might be seeking to add additional loudness is an important part of mastering, getting things to an appropriate level of loudness, maybe adding some dynamic range compression and some limiting. Another thing that we'd be looking into is there enough depth in this track, clarity in this track, separation between instruments? Can we enhance that stuff a little bit more? Do we want to get a more open sound? Do we want to get more depth? Or do things sound too harsh overall? Do they sound a little too tight and thin? Do we want to make them sound a little fuller and richer rather than adding more clarity? So those are two elements we might be looking at in our quality control. Frequency balances, are we getting those right? And then also our kind of textural balances almost. Are things too tight and harsh? Are things too muddy and loose? So there's that kind of sweetening aspect as well as an overall EQ aspect. There's the loudness aspect. There's the additional dynamic control aspect. Maybe we're looking to add additional width or tighten up the width. And a big thing that we're looking for is frequencies that are poking out way too much, like the mixer has way too much 8K in the vocal or in everything, and we're trying to subdue that a little bit. Or way too much 100 hertz, or not nearly enough 60 hertz. That kind of stuff. We're looking to fix those things in mastering. But it's a quality control thing. We're not looking to change mix relationships. So I think if you stop thinking about your mastering engineer as a mastering engineer, you think of them as one part quality control engineer and possibly one part sweetening engineer, that's a good way to think about what that role really is, quality control plus sweetening. Another place where the mastering engineer might help you out is quality control from song to song. Did you make an album or an EP where some of the songs are done with a live drum kit and some are done with an electronic drum kit, and they just have totally different timbres and levels of loudness? How do we make those sit better together? Do we want to bring them much closer together? Do some tracks, because they have a different type of bass or a different type of kick drum, have way more low end than other tracks? And do we want to bring those into better balance? How much do we want to bring them into better balance? To what extent do we want to allow them to sound different from each other, these tracks? So those are the questions that your quality control engineer / sweetening engineer is helping to answer for you. Now, you can be both of those people. That's generally not what I recommend. I generally recommend that if you want to do mastering, master some tracks for some engineer who's less experienced than you. And then use that money that you've earned to have your tracks mastered by some engineer or producer who's more experienced than you. Because I think it's one of the wonderful things about mastering is it's ideally an independent third-party QC on your tracks. And they can also turn into a little bit of a mixed coach. And I think that's one of the things that my clients love about me as a mastering engineer is when they want it, they'll say, hey, can you give me some feedback? Let me know how things are going. And I can write them a list of, hey, this sounded great. Here are the things that I tried to do. I tried to, smooth out the high end a little bit. There was something that was poking out a little bit too much for me there. I tried to, amp up this one particular area of the low end and control this other area in the low end. But if I was going to do anything differently, this is a common one. Maybe you could do a little bit more volume automation on this particular element. Maybe it's the vocal. I feel like it sounds like you picked one static level for the vocal and just let it sit for the whole track. But I think you're going to hear big improvements in the emotional arc of the song if you start thinking about going through a final vocal ride pass. And once you start really getting good at that and putting that into your process, maybe there's other elements you could ride. Maybe you could ride those guitars a little bit. Maybe you could ride that synth that comes in a little bit more. Or I might say, hey, on your particular track, I was getting too many transients off of the drums. So maybe you'd want to use some type of soft clipping or parallel compression to really control the transient levels of the drums, bring up the overall volume level so you get more tone and less transient by using some fast attack or soft clipping strategies, either direct or in parallel. So I can give them that kind of feedback. Or things were sounding great, but here's what I'm noticing. On all the mixes you sent me, there's way too much 100 hertz in the bass compared to all of your favorite records and references and stuff. Maybe you're not hearing 100 hertz properly in your room. Maybe there's a dip there, and that's something that you could investigate. Maybe you need to put in less 100 hertz into your mixes than you think should be there, or work on correcting your monitoring environment so you don't have that issue as much anymore. And that's the kind of quality control advice I can give as a third-party mastering engineer. And that's hard to do to yourself. That's hard to do when you're mastering your own stuff, because chances are you're mastering it in the same room that you mixed in the same speakers that you mixed in. And part of the benefit of mastering is having an independent third-party QC. Quality control. Your mastering engineer is your quality control engineer as well as your sweetening engineer, because the sweetening part, to some degree, you can do by yourself. And I can teach you how to do that by yourself. I'm not saying don't ever master your own stuff. There are some contexts in which you might want to do that. And I have a course that's all about it. It's called Mastering Demystified. You can get it at masteringdemystified.com, and you can learn all about how to master your own tracks or master tracks for others using basic tools, because all the stuff we use in mastering is the same stuff you use in mixing. There's EQs, there's compressors, there's, stereo wideners, there's dynamic EQs, there's multiband compressors. There's the same exact tools, but used in a different way with a different mindset. And I teach about that in the course, Mastering Demystified. So if you want to learn how to master your own stuff, master for others, it's a great one. I'll give you all these details in there. But I'd encourage you, in those cases where you can afford it, in those cases where something that's important, to seek out an outside mastering engineer, because how do you quality control yourself? If you could do perfect quality control on yourself, you would have gotten everything right, the mix, and you would have heard all of these things. And that actually can happen. There's some mixers I work with that do tremendous work, and they send me these mixes where I'm dismayed almost because there's so little that I have to do to them. And I want to wow them with how good of a mastering engineer I am. But the way that I show them that I'm a good mastering engineer in their case is to not do too much and just not ruin it and just check off the box and say, hey, I did my quality control on this. It sounds great. All I did was I brought up the low end here by a half a dB on this track and brought it down by a dB on this track, brought up by 3/4 of a dB on that track, added a little bit of loudness, added a tiny, tiny touch of shimmery top end on this one track. And I'm doing very tiny things, but it's really just almost complete quality control. And I'm doing almost no sweetening because the sweetening was so good. And from working with people like me in the past, they've integrated our quality control feedback into their mixing process. They've fixed their room. They've adjusted the way they hear things, the way they approach things. Their mastering engineer isn't coming back to them with the feedback of, have you thought about riding your vocal? Because they've already integrated that stuff and they're doing the vocal rides and they're riding other things as well. And they have these amazing mixes. So my job just becomes very light quality control and very light sweetening. So you can learn a lot from the mastering process, and you can do a lot of the things that the mastering engineer would have done for you, trying to brighten things up, trying to beef things up, trying to create more separation. You can do those things in the mix, but with a different mindset. And I do think, again, the mixer's mindset and set of tasks in front of them is different than the mastering engineer's mindset and the set of tasks that they're focused on. So I hope this is a useful way of thinking through this stuff for you. I think I've gone on long enough. This has been Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. If you want to go into more depth about mixing or mastering, I got 2 free workshops for you. First, the 5 habits of truly great mixers, which you can get at sonicscoop.com/mixhabits. That's sonicscoop.com/mixhabits, or Mastering 101, where I give you totally free workshop on the basics of mastering. Some of the ideas I gave you today are in there, but also some other new additional ideas. You can get that at SonicScoop.com/mastering101. That's SonicScoop.com/mastering101. Big thank you for you. If you've made it this far, I'd love to ask you to hit like and subscribe, and also that notifications bell so you don't miss any more videos from us. Also, you can subscribe to this on Apple Podcasts or anywhere else where you get your podcast, Spotify, all that stuff. And you consider leaving us a 5-star rating and review on one of those platforms. It super duper helps us out. Also, a big shout out to our sponsors, Soundtoys, making some of my favorite creative mixing effects. Check out anything they make for free at soundtoys.com. Just excellent plugins there all around. Do you have questions, comments of your own? Do you think this is a useful way of thinking about it? Let me know in the comments down below if you're on the YouTube version, or you can email me at podcast@sonicscoop.com. That's podcast@sonicscoop.com. Thanks so much for hanging out with me. This has been Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. See you next time.